So Zimri ben-Salu, the tribal chief of Shimon, doesn't go to the Midianite camp. He brings a Midianite princess into the Israelite camp. So what might his argument be here? He might be saying the problem is idolatry. And how does idolatry happen? When our men go to their camp, right? When our men go to the camp of the Gentiles, right? And are influenced. But what if we brought their women here? Now, this is very important because Zimri is a tribal chief of Shimon. Shimon is like one of the extreme expressions of Yehuda. And we learned earlier when we talked about the difference between Yehuda and Yosef, right? You see that Yosef, for the most part, is influenced, whereas Yehuda influences, right? Like in the same Parsha, we see that Yosef had to protect himself from being seduced by Potiphar's wife, and had he actually had sexual relations with Potiphar's wife, that would have been the end of Yosef. And in the very same Parsha, Yehuda has relations with Tamar. And it's not good, but it seems to work out. And it seems to actually bring Yehuda back and strengthen Yehuda ultimately. And we see throughout history that when Yosef tries to engage with the outside world, it's influenced, like the kingdom of Israel. Look at kings like Yerovam, Omri, Achav, right? Achav had a relationship with the Phoenicians. He married their princess, Izebel, which was very destructive for Achav and his kingdom. But you have also a king from Yehuda, Shlomo, who also had a relationship with the Phoenicians. And that led to the Phoenician king contributing wood to the Beit HaMikdash. So when Yehuda and its satellite tribes, we could argue, has a relationship with humanity, it leads to humanity getting on board with our mission. Whereas when Yosef has a relationship with humanity, it often leads to Yosef being influenced and kind of losing sight of the mission. So it could be that Zimri was making this argument. Wait, why are we letting our men go to their camp? We should be bringing their women to our camp. And if somebody said to Zimri, hey, wait a minute, but you can't go with a Midianite woman. Who says you can take a Midianite woman? And what might Zimri have said? Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? Moshe did it, why can't I do it? And Moshe doesn't have an answer to that. Moshe is speechless. Moshe is paralyzed. But Pinḥas ben Elazar, ben Aharon, Pinḥas at this point is not a Kohen, because he was born before his father and grandfather became Kohanim. The deal was that Aaron and his sons were made Kohanim, and any male offspring afterwards. But grandsons who had already been born were not Kohanim. Pinḥas is now going to become a Kohen, because he takes a spear and he basically kills Zimri and Cosby, the Midianite princess, while they're in the middle of the act. Right? He kind of spears them both, and he ends a plague that Hashem had sent into the Israelite camp as a result of what was going on. He is made a Kohen, and not only Kohen, he's becomes our leading prophet after Moshe, and then he becomes our Kohen Gadol when his father Elazar leaves the world, and then he becomes Eliyahu Navi. Right? He becomes a very important figure in our mythology, so to speak. In our it's interesting. After the Second Temple period, he'll be a little bit faded out, right? Like we don't, it used to be that Pinḥas was like a major figure we talk about, like, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, Yosef, right? Pinḥas was one of these figures, but after the destruction of our civilization by the Romans and the failure of the Zealot movement, Pinḥas will be kind of faded out as part of this effort to convince the Romans that we're non-threatening, and to convince ourselves that we're not supposed to be fighting right now. Like, we're not supposed to be fighting the Romans. We had to survive. And the rabbis at that period, especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt, understood that we can't just keep fighting the Romans. It'll be suicidal. We have to survive. So So here you see a very interesting distinction. First of all, between Moab and Midian, and also between Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi are both extreme expressions of Yehuda. By the way, Shimon might not have been the only tribe to have sinned here and been victimized by this plague. I mean, Shimon has a drastic population drop in the census that we're going to see. Much larger population drop than the 24,000 who were killed in the plague. But also Ephraim has a population drop. Naphtali has a population drop. Right? There are other tribes with population drops. Right? So it could be that some of these other tribes were also involved here. Now, Ephraim, it makes sense they could have been influenced, right? Because they're Yosef. But we have to ask ourselves a question about Shimon. What can Shimon be influenced by? Right? When you look at Shimon and Levi in Israeli society today, we could say both represent a form of Jewish fundamentalism, Jewish extremism. You can say that Shimon is the more like aggressive, less intellectual form of Jewish extremism. The Kahanistim, La Familia, like the Hilltop Youth, right? Like, and then Levi is the more intellectual, spiritually deep, let's say more like Haramor, right? And its satellites like the Kav, right? The ideological purists of the Rav Kook camp, right? There's no real difference in the Torah of Levi and the Torah of Yehuda, except maybe how they look at the other tribes, right? Levi might think that all the other tribes should become more like me and Yehuda, whereas Yehuda actually sees a value in Naphtali, and the value in Dan, and the value of Ephraim, and the value of Reuven, and saying that there's value to each one of the tribes to be who they're supposed to be. And that's why Yehuda's a leader. Yehuda's a leader for that reason. But the question is, what is Shimon susceptible to? Because what is the Torah telling us here? It could be telling us that because these women, the Moabite women or Midianite women, are likely allegorical for values and certain beliefs, etc. Now the tribe of Shimon, unlike let's say Yosef or Dan, the tribe of Shimon is not really susceptible, not really vulnerable to like the kind of like progressive liberal ideologies of the West. That's not something we see Shimon being influenced by generally. But what do we see Shimon in danger of being influenced by? Remember, Shimon, for the most part, right now, the tribe of Shimon sees this as a war with the Arabs. Right? The Arabs want to hurt us, we have to hurt the Arabs. That's kind of Shimon's approach. Levi is much more conscious of a bigger and deeper cultural conflict, a clash of civilizations between Israel and Western civilization, Israel and Esav. I think from Levi's perspective, the real threat is different. The enemy is different. But because Shimon doesn't necessarily see that or fully understand it, they're vulnerable to the influence not of liberal Western ideas, but right-wing Western ideas. Right? Some of the ideas, that we see peddled by, Ben Shapiro, or Jordan Peterson, or Dennis Prager. Now, some of these people are actually Jews, but when their ideas and their values and their politics and their worldviews end up seeping in to Jewish nationalists here, that's also a threat. And that also takes us away from who we are. It's also a compromise at some level. Look, like for example, just to give one example, this idea on the American right, it's normal to deny climate chaos, right? That there's actually like a real threat to our natural world from the behavior of human beings and corporations, etc. Right? Now we all know that a lot of the scientific studies trying to dispute climate change were actually paid for by Exxon, right? Oil company. But the fact that it exists gives people the space to believe what they want to believe. Most people believe what they want to believe. But what does that have to do with the Jewish national struggle? Meaning, of what relevancy is it to someone who's a Jew with a strong national consciousness, living in Judea, fighting for the land of Israel, fighting for the Torah? What is it? First of all, why should he be buying into this climate change denial? Right? But you see a lot of ideas. You see a lot of it, especially with Trump and the energy around the Trump campaign. Right? You see that there are a lot of certainly pro-Israel Jews in the West. Are obviously because they're living in the West. They're living in Western civilization. I'm not even sure if they're Shimon or if they're just kind of like a right-wing expression of Ephraim, like a right-wing expression of Yosef. But they're obviously very influenced by Trump and Trump's image, rhetoric, aesthetics, politics, etc. But why are Jews here being influenced by that? Right? That's danger. And maybe that's what the Torah is telling us here, with how Shimon can be vulnerable. We have to know that because Shimon doesn't necessarily have the higher understanding of Levi, of what the real threats are, what we have to defend ourselves against, Shimon is vulnerable not from liberal Western ideologies in the way that maybe a lot of Yosef Jews might be, but from right-wing Western ideologies. Okay. So, and again, Pinḥas is from Levi. Pinḥas doesn't have this problem. Pinḥas neutralizes the threat. And Shimon will ultimately be absorbed into Yehuda. Shimon is going to essentially become part of Yehuda. Shimon's role in Yehuda, and maybe a little bit beyond the tribe of Yehuda, will be early childhood education. Because Shimon is really great at teaching kids. Getting kids on mission. Remember, Shimon was actually, according to Chazal, Shimon was given this role in reward for leading the attack on Shechem. Remember, Shimon and Levi, when they were 14 and 13 years old, they went to rescue their sister from the city of Shechem, and they killed a lot of people. Dinah had been raped, and they weren't going to let that stand. And Shimon is rewarded with responsibility for early childhood education. Right? So Shimon is really good at teaching kids, but once you get to a certain age, you need Levi, or you need Yisachar, or you need Yehuda, or you need maybe a higher level of Torah, a more nuanced Torah, a more sophisticated Torah, because we can see, I think, from what the Torah is showing us here, that Shimon, even though they have a great national consciousness, right, a great Jewish national consciousness, they're living in the story of Israel, they're willing to fight the enemies of Israel, they're zealots too, but they don't have the bigger picture. And they're therefore vulnerable to some of the ideologies of foreign civilizations, especially the more nationalist, right-wing, even fascist ideologies of Western civilization that we need to protect ourselves from as well. Right?